all the way from University of Oxford. Marina is Professor of Human-Centered Computing in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oxford. I won't give you a full resume, it's on the website. Nevertheless, you have been thinking and talking about these issues for some time, and a proposition which I hope is really going to shake us up is this thought about can we have responsible innovation? And if we don't, what are the consequences? So you're going to talk to us for around about 45 minutes. We're really looking forward to it, Marina. Thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you all for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really excited about it. I'll be focusing the talk mostly on the notion of responsible innovation, which is my background, and the potential links to digital sustainability. I'm sorry that this is being done virtually and remotely, which isn't really ideal, but I'm sure that with the excellent facilitation, it will all go very smoothly. So just to give you a little bit of information about me, because it gives the background motivation to the talk. Oh, I need to put my slides up. Sorry, I haven't shared my screen. There we are. There we are. And there we are. Can you all see my screen? Peter, can we see the screen?
Yeah, that looks perfect.
Great, sorry about that. Okay, so briefly, as Peter said, I'm Professor of Human-Centered Computing, and I lead an interdisciplinary research group in the Department of Computer Science at Oxford, and that really combines both social and computer science approaches to the design of technology. We look into methods and approaches for building and evaluating technology responsibly in ways that we try to enhance individual autonomy, well-being, and promote and protect human values. So for example, we have projects currently investigating how to build and enhance trust in algorithms, focusing specifically on the young and older demographic. This builds on previous work looking at algorithmic bias and how to emancipate users against such bias. We've been leading an initiative into responsible innovation for quantum technologies, and I've recently been awarded an EPSRC fellowship into responsible robotics, which I'll mention a bit more of later. I'm also co-director of an observatory for responsible innovation in ICT, or Orbit, and that provides or gives kind of responsible innovation consultancy and services to researchers and practitioners, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So you can see that underlying all the research that I've been doing really for the last 10 to 12 years is a commitment to responsible innovation. So the overview of the talk, and apologies because some of the material you may already be familiar with, but I need to kind of think about how to frame some of these issues around responsible innovation. We'll look at some of the broader issues of sustainability and how ICT might be helping or hindering focusing on the digital. I'll introduce you to responsible innovation and its background. I'll discuss some new initiatives there and some recommendations for research going forward. So if I start with the broader context of where we are now, and as I say, many of the issues I'm sure you're familiar with, the most recent state of the future report from the Millennium Projects paints quite a stark picture of the challenges that face humanity in the 21st century. These include radical climate change, increasing energy demands, population growth, and lack of access to clean water. It didn't at the time predict COVID, but it now seems clear that recurrences of pandemics are inevitable. The kind of pessimistic outlook from the Millennium Project is also echoed in other places. The Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge, and other horizon scanning reports or research institutes around the world have issued increasingly troubled and troubling reports in the last few years. They point to a world where carbon reduction targets are constantly missed, where environmental protections are eroded or simply ignored, and where the invasion of humans into the wilder world may lie at the root of novel disease forms. So most recently, the UN's Environment Chief has warned that the coronavirus pandemic is an SOS signal for the human enterprise, and that current economic thinking does not recognize that human wealth depends on nature's health. At the same time as these increasing threats posed by the degradation of our environment has come nothing less than a revolution in ICT. And these have become now so embedded in our daily lives that we just take them for granted. How could we have got through, as Peter said, these lockdowns without the ubiquitous smartphones, broadband, and other IT infrastructures? Current initiatives focus on the potential of machine learning and big data and robotics to benefit society. And just on the horizon, we have hopes for quantum computing to be another step change in this direction. However, these technologies also have costs to our societies, to the environment, to our privacy and security, and we now urgently need to measure these technologies against the indicators that are used for sustainability. The UN focuses on 3, as I'm sure you know, environmental, social, and economic, but other researchers such as Becker increase this to 5 dimensions, focusing also on technical and individual elements. So it's become increasingly important to recognize the impacts on the environment, not just from humanity, but of the ICT technologies that we are so easily taking for granted and that we frequently rely on now to live and work. It's not news that the digital revolution, amazing though it's been, is not without its downside. And this is expressed not least in its energy demands. Data and digital technologies promise to contribute to the goal of sustainable development by providing information to reduce energy consumption and afford us a green alternative to industries and behavior with a higher environmental footprint. But this digital footprint has an important environmental impact. It's widely acknowledged in the context of environmental research that ICT in general and data centers and cloud computing in particular have a very heavy footprint, featuring high consumption of non-renewable energy, waste production, and CO2 emissions. Some researchers estimate that collectively the ICT industry could be consuming 1/5 of the world's total energy output in just 5 years' time by 2025. In 2017, data centers more globally used roughly 416 terawatt hours, about 3% of the total global electricity production. This was predicted at the time to double every 4 years, though there are some forecasts that suggest that by 2025, data centers could consume 20% of the world's electricity. A single data center can actually use as much electricity as a medium-sized town. Most of these are powered by non-renewable energy sources. Many of the buildings also rely on 24/7 all year round air conditioning in order to prevent the equipment from overheating. And this again consumes more electricity. This year, 3.5% of global emissions are expected to be produced by the data industry. That overtakes that of the aviation and shipping industries. Then we think about the energy use of Bitcoin, which is now approximately calculated to be 53 terawatts annually. This is roughly equivalent to the energy use of Switzerland. It is so bloated that Cambridge University's Business School has created a special tool to track it in real time, scaling up to calculate annual usage. A team at MIT has estimated that the associated carbon emissions fit somewhere between the levels produced by the nations of Jordan and Sri Lanka. A recent report from the International Data Corporation forecast that in 2025, there will be 41.6 billion connected devices, Internet of Things, enabled by 5G technologies and generating 79.4 zettabytes of data. The environmental costs of the generation and processing of such amounts of data through AI and smart devices go beyond CO2 emissions. They also include the unsustainable practices of mineral extraction and e-waste disposal, often conducted in informal settings in low and middle income countries and with exposure to toxic emissions for those working on these sites. And if we think we might have gone greener through the pandemic, in a recent article entitled "Why Going Digital in Pandemic Times Might Not Be as Green as You Think," Alexander Taylor from Cambridge urges us to check the now normal assumption that the digitization or virtualization of human activities is somehow by default the greener solution. He argues that the answer to more sustainable futures of work is not as simple as switching from the office to the home, and conferences are not carbon neutral simply because they take place online. He suggests and gives an argument that the pandemic is good. He suggests that the argument that this pandemic is good for climate change consistently overlooks the environmental impact of remote working, web conferencing, social media usage, and so forth. And he concludes that the global north is apparently still on track to release 95% of the carbon dioxide emitted in a typical year. The coronavirus might have improved global air quality for a moment in time by reducing road and air traffic, but with surging levels of data traffic, the actual carbon footprint of a digital activity during lockdown is yet to be calculated. Now, you may be familiar with this. I wanted to go through it because it's an amazing and beautiful and complex piece of artwork developed by Kate Crawford and Vladan Jola, which shows everything that powers an Amazon echo, from data mines to the lakes of lithium. The full-sized artwork is a huge map, 2 meters high, 5 meters across. It traces every single one of the systems used to power this complex AI-powered gadget. The map is called An Anatomy of an AI System, but its subtitle demonstrates its scope, the Amazon Echo as an anatomical map of human labor, data, and planetary resources. And what do the majority of people use this incredibly complicated and resource-intensive piece of equipment for? Listening to music, converting units and recipes, and turning the lights on and off. It is very easy to consider the costs of ICT as simply physical, to focus on the extraction of raw lithium known as grey gold, the production of components, and the energy associated with designing, building, and using data artifacts. However, this map stresses to us that the human and societal costs need to be counted too. This is a close-up of the very top of the map. What we see here is one tiny section of the entire process, the point at which an owner is using their echo. They speak to it and receive answers. They might ask, what is the weather going to be like today? And they'll get the weather forecast for their area. It's not an accident that the users are included in the map of this AI system. What we can see in the top section of the screen is that the users are, by design, part of that system. By owning and using the AI, they are essentially providing Amazon with free labor. So when they speak, they are helping to refine Amazon's speech recognition systems. Their voice data is stored for future use. Their requests and searches are stored so as to more accurately target and advertise advertisements for what users actually see. All of this is added to the vast data sets in order to train further AIs and to be shared with other parties. The problems with this are plain. Not only is the user's immaterial labor unrecognized and provided for free, but they are sacrificing oftentimes privacy and their digital security. This is an extractive process in the same way as the rest of the map. Below the line that represents the human echo interface, we see in-home infrastructure, the Wi-Fi providing invisible infrastructure, and the visible elements, the booster, the router, the cable connected to the outside world. The infrastructure too is highly detailed and significant, not least the components of the Echo Dot itself, some of which are listed here. Here also we see some of the issues that are packaged with the Echo. There is no right to repair, for example, so consumers are not supported to fix their own devices. Obsolescence is built in. These devices are not built for longevity, but rather for replacement, and all that that implies for the materials that went into building them. Again, security is a low priority. Hackers have been able to break into the smart speakers like these with relative ease to eavesdrop on conversations. As Crawford and Jola point out in discussing this map, each small moment of convenience, be it answering a question, turning on a light, or playing a song, requires a vast planetary network fueled by the extraction of non-renewable materials, labor, and data. So from this, we can actually see the need to consider digital sustainability in a social sense, as well as an environmental and economic way. They cannot be disassociated. The costs here can impact on individuals, communities, and society's well-being. For example, ghost workers are one of the unseen, unacknowledged parts of the supposed artificial intelligence that we see on the internet. They perform what is essentially piecework that has the sole aim of maintaining the illusion of AI. They act as content moderators, they label images, they proofread, and much, much more. Gray and Suri, in their wonderful book, The Ghost Work, estimate that 8% of Americans have worked at least once in this unseen part of the economy, and that the number is growing. They usually earn less than the minimum wage, they have no health benefits, and they can be fired at any time for any reason, or no reason at all. There are no employment protections to govern this kind of work, and these latter-day assembly lines are populated by all kinds of workers who can't get a job that they want. They are described as disposable people. As I'm sure you're aware, there are many significant problems to be addressed relating to digital sustainability here, but there are also people who are working on potential solutions. Researchers around the world working hard to try and ensure that digital solutions can help us without making the situation worse. For example, there's work that uses digital transformation technologies to look at supply chain management in ways that actually cut emissions and specifically focus on improving the environment and the societal impacts. Likewise, others are examining ways in which digital technologies can help mitigate the effects of climate change or wildlife crimes. Tech companies are well aware that they use vast quantities of energy, and even if just for financial reasons, are trying to shift their energy demands to more sustainable models. Google already uses renewable energy to run its data centers, but in April, Google announced that it was moving its scheduled load management, for example, its training of AI models, to coincide with peaks in renewable energy supplies. So when the wind blows and the sun shines, Google is running its energy-heavy video transcoding. These potential solutions are very important, but they still seem a bit piecemeal and unconnected. We know that increasingly powerful technologies are being developed that have the potential to transform society and impact on our environment. And investigators are under growing pressure to consider and reflect on the motivations, the purposes, and the possible consequences that might be associated with their research. It's becoming undesirable as a developer and designer to ignore what is happening societally and environmentally as a consequence of some of our innovations. But every new technology raises questions, doesn't it, as it becomes embedded in society? Questions like who benefits? What are the risks? What if we're wrong? What are the alternatives? Who decides? Who's in control? And who is responsible? Unfortunately, while it's really easy to ask these questions, as we stand looking at a new technology from where we are now, it's really difficult to foresee the answers with any degree of certainty. As far back as 1980, David Collingridge, in his book, The Social Control of Technology, expressed this very well in the form of a dilemma. When change is easy, the need for it can be foreseen. When the need for change is apparent, changes become expensive, difficult, and time-consuming. If we knew now how some technology could intertwine with society and the environment, and we could foresee now how the negative impacts could be averted and more positive impacts increased, it's quite likely that we could make comparatively small changes to technology with a minimum of effort and expense. But once a technology is out in the wild and it's thoroughly embedded in our society, then lock-ins occur, path dependencies happen. It may become all so entrenched that it's difficult or impossible to make changes. One way of dealing with the sort of unintended and hard to foresee and perhaps undesirable consequences of innovation is to maintain what Collingridge called the corrigibility, constantly looking backwards to fix as soon as possible, but not too soon, the errors and problems as they kind of emerge. This is being put into practice that we can see through things like technology assessment or laws and regulations to clean up any harmful impacts of technology to society and the environment once they actually become apparent. But such sort of retroactive assessment will always be too late, and there is commonly a delay between the uptake of new technologies and the time it takes for law and technologies to be enforced. This is expressed as a dilemma. On the one horn of the dilemma is the desire to control as little as possible, except perhaps with certain technologies such as those in pharmaceuticals or weaponry, which are generally recognized as high risk. And often entrenched interests resist any control. A typical argument often made is that innovation should be allowed to take its course, and people who call for controls may be dismissed as Luddites or afraid of change or so on. But by doing nothing, we may become highly dependent on the innovation and locked in. Path dependencies might embed a less than optimal technology in society, or as in the case of some financial innovations, there might be perverse incentives to choose short-term gains over long-term goals. We know that we can't predict the future and the future impacts of research with any certainty. Attempting to control and prevent can leave us stuck with the status quo. Doing nothing means that control of future directions might be in the hands of whoever is strongest in the innovation space. So what might we do? An initiative then known as responsible innovation suggests that rather than control based on prediction, we can start to think more positively and much more creatively if we begin to anticipate the shape of possible outcomes. We can see the outline of the future space, even if we can't yet perceive in detail what it contains. Anticipation is different superficially from things like prediction or foresight because it makes no claim on an actual near-distant future. And unlike prudence or providence, it doesn't simply ask for vigilance against dangers as they appear. It's related to this idea of capacity. We don't know what the future holds, but we can develop a capacity to be ready for it. We don't know how or when the capacities we have will be needed, but we do know that they'll place us in a better position to meet whatever the future holds. So in this way, rather than focusing any responsibilities on whether the outcomes of research are good or bad according to the balance of risks and benefits, responsible innovation aims for science and society to work together and to ask questions like, what kind of society do we want, and how can science and innovation help us to achieve it? So I really want to illustrate some of these ideas with the case of genetically modified crops in Europe, the lessons that seem highly relevant to us currently, given the focus on corporate interests, academic research, and the trust in the relationship between the public, the government, and scientists, and which also shows perhaps how not to innovate responsibly. Now, there were a very complex set of issues behind the GM story, and I'm sure you're aware of some of those, but I'll do a very light touch here. In the mid-1990s, a large multinational company tried to push a new technology, GM soya, onto the European market as a fait accompli. This push produced a backlash, and NGOs which had previously not been too concerned about GM organisms suddenly took notice. The result was a bitter fight between a few large companies on one side and increasingly vocal NGOs on the other. The public became increasingly suspicious of GMs in general, and the result has been a more or less ban on GM crops across Europe. At a first pass, this might seem like a classic example of technology push, and we can see how this may be unlikely to work, but that's not quite the point I want to make. A more fundamental problem was the official European government and company responses to the situation, which responded to specific identified risks in a piecemeal manner, trying to allay public fears by educating and reassuring them, rather than by listening. Regulators discussed the issues almost exclusively as an issue of risk to the environment and public health. They failed to think about people's fears that unintended effects are unpredictable and therefore unknown to science. Neither did they address the potentially transformative impact on the societal structures, which then severely eroded public trust in these institutions. By not taking account of what was driving public concern, the motives of those who were developing these regulatory frameworks seemed suspect. The initial reaction to the public response to GM crops was to dismiss many of their fears as irrational, and regulators and scientists tried to regain public trust by educating them with facts and information. Predictably, the more the company attempted to reassure the public, the more the public became suspicious. As this quote suggests, insistence by a company or government regulator that its information embraces all that is necessary to know about such products risks actively reinforcing disquiet rather than allaying it, with potentially destabilizing consequences. But the basic failure was, first of all, a failure to anticipate and reflect on the wider risks and consequences of GM organisms, such that regulations were exclusively focused on safety aspects and the broader environmental, social, and agricultural contexts were not brought into the equation. And secondly, there was a complete failure to engage openly with stakeholders, so that methods of one-way information provision were wholly inadequate for the task of addressing the human tensions and social dynamics. By the second half of the 1990s, this strategy proved to be ineffective, and the EU moved to more participatory strategies. The main driver for this was the belief that to ensure societally accountable development of technologies, there must be larger public involvement in debates and decisions. And that research must focus on what Morten Østergaard, the former Minister of Science in Denmark, said opening a conference on science society in Europe in 2012. We need ambition at a policy level to support the best science for the world and not just the best science in the world. It was against this context that responsible innovation, or RI, first appeared. So it first appeared as initiatives across policy, academia, and legislation nearly 2 decades ago. It began with an aim to identify and address uncertainties and risks associated with novel areas of research, such as nanotechnology, geoengineering, and synthetic biology. The scope of responsible innovations has recently expanded to include computer science, robotics, informatics, and ICT more generally. In the EU, where a great deal of fundamental research in and for RI has been undertaken, it's been a cross-cutting issue in Horizon 2020. And the EU also reiterated its commitment to RI in the 2014 Treaty of Rome. In the UK, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, or EPSRC, which funds a huge amount of research in science and technology, has recently made a commitment to RI across its ICT portfolio of research grants. So what is RI responding to? It's responding to the fact that many of the problems we face are a legacy of our failing to attend to the potential negative impacts of our innovations in the past. And increasingly, the public and media are expressing concerns over those negative consequences. This is a context where technologies are becoming ever more potent. Nanotechnology seeks the ability to manipulate matter at a fundamental level. Synthetic biology aims to create new forms of life. AI and increasing automation risk de-skilling and disenfranchising the most vulnerable in our society. And transhumanism that aims to transform the human condition by developing and making sophisticated technologies to greatly enhance human intellect and physiology come with the associated fears of meddling with nature. Now, responsible innovation is not just a set of principles, but there are some practical actions and a framework which are suggested as a way to carry this forward. The core aims to involve all relevant stakeholders, including the public, and to encourage those stakeholders to anticipate and reflect on the consequences of scientific and technological innovations. And this is in instances of a high degree of uncertainty and ambiguity about the future pathways of innovation. In this context, rules and regulations to address specific risks are unlikely to be adequate, no matter how widely we engage. So it's been defined, RI has been defined as doing science and innovation with society and for society, including the involvement of society very upstream in the process of research and innovation. That is at the point where the innovation may even first be conceived, in order to align with the outcomes and values of society. And a further aspect that's worth stressing is that it's about responsible innovation is about anticipating problems, taking into account wider social, ethical, and environmental issues, and being able to create flexible and adaptive systems to try to deal with the unintended consequences, or something that is known as anticipatory governance. Because as Richard Owen says, we have a duty of care for future outcomes of current creative processes. Responsible innovation is work that is still being developed, and there are many challenges going forward, but is trying to address some of the issues mentioned previously through a set of processes for ensuring that innovation benefits society and the environment. It draws on anticipatory governance, where both the potential positive and negative consequences of an innovation may be anticipated and brought to developers' and innovators' attention in order to try to influence the development trajectory of that innovation. Now, there's a number of frameworks, and I've mentioned some of them here on the slide. Several of them are built upon the 6 pillars, though, of ethics, open access, governance, gender equality, science communication, and public engagement. So building on Owen and Stilgoe's work in geoengineering, the EPSRC harmonized these principles into something called the Area Framework that I'm sure you may be familiar with by now. And what does this actually do? The framework breaks down how to consider doing RI itself into a broad set of activities. The first dimension is to anticipate, describing and analysing the impacts, good and bad, intended and unintended, that might arise from a new technology. This isn't about trying to predict what is going to happen or likely to happen, but within the bounds of plausibility, opening up the space for discussion, even if there's no concrete evidence, to try to envision future consequences. So rather than attempting to control the future or passively waiting for the next stage of development to be revealed, anticipation actively tries to open up the design space, creatively seeking or underexplored pathways and digging into their potential implications. Secondly, responsible innovation is reflective, thinking carefully about the overall purposes and motivations, identifying what we know and what we don't know, and not being afraid to admit that there are associated uncertainties, risks, areas of ignorance, assumptions, questions, and dilemmas. Being reflective in practice is trying to make visible the often hidden dominant values and assumptions, holding up a mirror to them, and looking also at one's own assumptions as a developer. It's pausing to reflect, recognizing the limits of your own knowledge, and being aware of the broader systemic context of the problem that's actually being addressed. Thirdly, it engages, it opens up visions, purposes, questions, and dilemmas to an inclusive and wide-ranging deliberation through formal and informal processes of dialogue, engagement, and debate. Engagement will provide different perspectives and will certainly open up new issues. So that finally, it acts to influence the direction and the trajectory of the research and innovation process itself. The core idea here is responsiveness as a kind of aspect of responsibility. This might involve formal mechanisms of participation like citizen juries or focus groups. It involves also anticipatory governance or whatever assists to make sure that science and society are mutually responsive to each other. And this isn't a once and for all, but it's an ongoing process, looking at how new technologies meld with old, how people adapt, and how we as researchers and innovators adapt to emerging knowledge of technology use in the world. The framework set out here tries to be as practical as possible, bearing in mind that research and innovation is often unpredictable and unclear. It's not a linear progression from one dimension to the next, but it's iterative and a flexible set of processes. Being responsive includes being reflective and engaging. Often reflection involves elements of anticipation. Engagement can and should throw up new issues which require further reflection. And in this way, responsible innovation is not at all about closing down options, but rather, it's argued, can provide a space for creativity and for confidence and for serendipity. It's not predefining what are and what are not right impacts for research, but it's about providing us with a framework which can help us to decide what those impacts might be and how we might realize them. So it was this thinking that led to the creation of Orbit that I mentioned earlier. This is rooted in the recognition that responsible innovation must be embedded in practice. It must be a mindset or a kind of thought process. The logic of that led us to the conclusion that this type of thinking might be embedded in the training of those who go on to form the next generation of developers and innovators. And that is what Orbit funded in the Orbit project. Sorry, that's what the EPSRC funded in the Orbit project. This has been an incredibly exciting thing to lead. It represents the first attempt to roll out responsible innovation, not just as part of project design, but as an essential feature of the training of new generations of scientists and engineers. Orbit has been part of the effort to provide leadership, to support the responsible innovation community, and to provide responsible innovation services to academics, to industry, to innovators alike. But many challenges remain, none the least on how to embed it into the processes of technological design and development. Furthermore, as the pace of innovation continues to grow, the tension between profit and responsibility also grows stronger. So for just looking at a few of these, how do we embed RI into the varying practices of design and development? How do we engender meaningful stakeholder engagement and inclusivity? And how do we encourage global and international responsibility? So I'll give you a very brief example of an investigation where we are applying an RI approach related to ICT, that of an EPSRC funded fellowship that I was awarded looking into responsible robotics, where we're actually exploring a technology needed to support robot accident investigations, which from our anticipatory work, we argue will be inevitable and have already occurred with social robots. Alan Winfield, who is Professor of Robot Ethics at Bristol Robotics Lab, and I published a paper in 2017 where we argued that robots and autonomous systems should be equipped with the equivalent of an aircraft flight data recorder to continuously record sensor and relevant internal status data. We call this an ethical black box after the black box on aeroplanes. Our proposition is very simple, that all robots and some AIs should be equipped by law with a standard device which continuously records a time-stamped log of the internal state of the system, key decisions, and sampled input or sensor data, in effect, the robot equivalent of an aircraft flight data recorder. Without such a device, finding out what the robot was doing and why in the moments leading up to an accident is more or less impossible. We argue that an ethical black box will play a key role in the processes of discovering why and how a robot caused or contributed to an accident, and thus will be an essential part of establishing accountability and responsibility. Our strongest argument for the EBB is meaningful transparency as a fundamental element of RI, the basic ethical principle that it should always be possible to find out why an autonomous system made a particular decision about you particularly. Without transparency, you cannot have accountability or ultimately, it's argued, trust. But transparency is not a given. It has to be designed into systems, and the ethical black box is one way of building transparency into autonomous systems. In Robotics, we'll be developing and testing a model for ABB for social robots. The air accident investigations in which the EBB is founded are social processes of reconstruction that need to be perceived as impartial and robust, and which may serve as a form of closure so that the aviation industry does not acquire an enduring taint in the public's consciousness. We anticipate very similar roles for investigations into robot accidents. Crucially, it's not the black box on its own that forms a safety mechanism. It's its inclusion in the social process of accident incident investigation. An investigation will draw on the EBB information and information from human witnesses and experts to determine the reason for an accident, and lessons will be learnt from it. So alongside the technical parameters of what to record in the EBB, we also have to consider how the interpretation of those data fit into the process of an investigation. And this work is currently underway. For anyone who's interested, I've provided references at the end of this presentation. As I mentioned before, responsible innovation is continually reflecting as new understandings emerge. And recently we've been reconsidering digital sustainability in responsible robotics, and we've started to shift our understanding of what responsible robotics might mean. So we've reshaped our definition of responsible robotics as the application of responsible innovation in the design, manufacture, operation, repair, and end-of-life recycling of robots that seeks the most benefit to society and the least harm to the environment. And Alan Winfield goes a step further. As a leading researcher in the field of robotics, he argues that the power needed computational material for AI is huge, and therefore may advance climate change rather than address it. He suggests that we should only look to AI solutions in society if we can dramatically decrease the environmental cost. To explore some of these sustainability and RI issues further, we ran a workshop led by Federica Lucivero from Ethox and the Wellcome Centre for Ethics and Humanities at Oxford, and Gabriel Samuel from the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. We worked with a variety of interdisciplinary colleagues from various other universities to more clearly try and map out the conceptual landscape on the environmental impacts of data-driven technologies. We wanted to debate why the field has escaped so much of policymakers and ethicists' attention, and to explore how ethical thinking can contribute to it. Several themes emerged. I'm outlining three here. First, questions of definition and scope. In particular, how we place boundaries that can help us describe the field of data-driven digital sustainability. It was really recognized that until we could understand and describe the environmental impacts and data-driven technologies that were under scrutiny, discussions in this already heterogeneous field would suffer from different disciplines and sectors invariably talking over each other. This was complicated by the use of different types of terminology in this field, perhaps because of the interdisciplinary nature. Choosing suitable terms, however, is very complex and value-laden, as I'm sure you know. You only need to consider digital sustainability versus digital pollution. Data-driven environmental impacts need to be balanced against the social value of data. Data-driven technologies is a complex balancing act. First of all, evidence on the environmental impact of the data-driven technology revolution is inconsistent, sparse, and hard to compare. Studies start from different assumptions even. They include individual value-based judgments in their data models, and they vary in both scope, what data infrastructure is included in the calculations, and the stage of the supply chain measured, with few offering an end-to-end assessment. While exact numbers may not be available, there is robust evidence and agreement that data-driven infrastructures do have conspicuous, often neglected environmental impacts. This shifts questions from how to measure these impacts to how to evaluate their uncertainty against the also uncertain social value of data-driven technologies. This raises further questions. How do we best measure social values in this context? What benefits are more important than others and make us willing to accept some environmental risks? Which are less important or less valuable? How do we decide which is better? Such questions are inherently complicated, as there are different dimensions to take into account when we're discussing value trade-offs and balances. Decisions reducing environmental impacts can be made at different levels of the data journey, from manufacturing to data use, and can differ depending on how valuable the data-driven technology is considered. And the third theme is that of responsibility. Questions of responsibility are key to this discussion. They are both empirical, who is taking responsibility and how, and normative, who should take responsibility and how. and they can be addressed at different levels, including individual, corporate, public, institutional responsibility. While the environmental impact of data-driven technologies has escaped much public attention, highlighting the link between individuals' digital data and the environmental impact is crucial and could come with increasing public awareness. Grassroots groups and activists are already holding corporate and public bodies to account. Corporations themselves are becoming greener, employing sustainability advocates and increasing their renewable energy supply as a response to civil society organizations' criticisms and public sensitivities, the growing public sensitivities towards environmental questions. In an analogy then to Ben Wagner's ethics washing, or companies attempting to appear ethical rather than actually being ethical, these initiatives in some cases may also be considered as an attempt at greenwashing, and therefore we continually have to be critically assessing and monitoring what is going on there. The article I've mentioned then, which summarizes all of this, promotes a holistic approach to issues of digital sustainability. As mentioned previously, gathering and comparing evidence on environmental impact of data-driven technologies is necessary in a discussion on digital sustainability, but not sufficient. The discussion encompasses issues of responsibility and value, but also interests, needs, and inequalities. In this sense, to explore digital sustainability, we need a holistic approach that takes into account moral, political, social, cultural, environmental, geographical, and economical aspects, together with the technical and scientific ones. If you'd like to know more about this, I put the reference to the outputs of the workshop is given below and at the end of the slides. Some of these issues then have already contributed to a new research agenda from EPSRC, which has recently started to highlight the importance of research into digital sustainability. So a community of ICT researchers recently proposed an additional theme for a call for proposals for digital economy sustainability. Now, the EPSRC digital economy theme actually supports interdisciplinary research to realize the transformational impact on digital technologies on aspects of community life, cultural experiences, future society, and the economy. It is developing the following 5 new priority areas to be released in summer 2020, one of which is sustainable digital society, which is quite new, and where a call for proposals is actually coming out next month. So this call recognizes that while digital technologies have the potential to bring about social and economic cultural benefits, increasingly they're associated with growing ecological burdens and social divisions. This socio-technical priority then is trying to focus on the use of digital technologies to address anthropogenic environmental impacts and improve environmental sustainability, whilst also considering the ongoing impacts associated with the creation and use of digital technologies themselves, to ultimately try and create a sustainable digital society. It's worth just pointing out 2 things here. Funded projects will have at least 50%. They must be at least within 50% of EPSRC remit. And the primary definition of sustainability in this call is environmental sustainability, although they acknowledge that social and economic sustainability are interlinked. And that will be addressed in the future in the Equitable Digital Societies call that you can see just above it. And you can find out much more about this in their website. Just to give you some examples of the kinds of things they're looking for: how can novel digital technologies be used to shift patterns of consumption and foster more sustainable ways of living and different economic arrangements? How can policymakers and businesses understand the needs and preferences of large numbers of individuals via digital technology? How can digital technologies be made sustainable end-to-end from conception through to design and development to maintenance, upgrade or evolution and decommissioning? These are very broad, high-level issues, but they're very important, and I hope you'll take a look at the call when it comes out in July. Whilst these are high level, we also need to consider our own practices as researchers and what we're doing now in conference, for example. And I just want to end up with this kind of, with this conference. Currently, we're having a virtual conference and some things have changed. But as discussed previously, there will be socio-digital costs even if we're not traveling. And if we do get back to a time where we have conference co-presence, we may want to start considering the environmental costs of that. Now, we tried to do this in a very small way in a recent conference that we organised through Orbit. Last September, we hosted what we believe is Oxford's first carbon neutral conference. We decided from the very beginning of the process of organising the event that we wanted to try to aim for carbon neutrality. It was a complex and highly involved process, and much of this won't be new to you, but it involved a great deal of work and detail to make it happen. The first piece of advice we received from an expert group of climate change mitigation professionals was, don't hold the conference at all. Carbon offsetting becomes a very poor second to not creating the carbon in the first place. However, having committed to that, we employed a specialist company to calculate the carbon that would be generated. We then assessed every decision we took on the basis of its potential for carbon generation. This required going into significant detail. For example, we selected our printer on the basis of their own carbon mitigation efforts. The company we chose maintained a sustainable tree planting program to offset its carbon, as well as providing numerous climate-friendly options. Some decisions were obvious. We chose vegetarian food from sources that were as local as possible. We also did without conference giveaways. We kept branding to a minimum, and we tried to find items that could actually be reused. For example, we had no conference-specific pop-up banners because these are hugely difficult to recycle. Having done our best to minimize the carbon, we then needed to measure the carbon that would be generated by the event. This required gathering details during the registration process from every attendee. For example, where they were coming from, their mode of travel, what class were they flying in, and where were they staying. Our conference venue generously worked with us to calculate their own carbon footprint for the duration of the college, in the college, and this had to include the resources that would be used by those staying for the event. And we actually came up with a measure for our reduction efforts, which resulted in a relatively low figure in all of 80 tons of carbon generated. By far the largest item of that was aviation carbon. 26 flights generated 96% of the carbon, highlighting how crucial this issue is for academic conferences. We subsequently commissioned the company Carbon Footprint to offset the carbon through a mix of sustainable rainforest protection and tree planting. As a result of our activities, we were certified as a carbon neutral event, the first conference we believe in Oxford of its kind. And we hope that it's a first step in creating a new standard for conferences, carbon neutrality. We were able to use this work to start a conversation with our delegates about the carbon cost of conferences. We even saw some of our attendees who went on to speak at other conferences challenge the organisers on their carbon record. So to summarise these issues, we must get better at factoring the environmental consequences of future activity into our decision making to reduce and avoid future emissions. We need to be able to do this when we actually have very incomplete information about our activities, and we have to try and allow for some recourse. The repair, the care and maintenance of digital tools opens up a whole set of questions relating to how we design, how we build technology in the first place, including issues related to open hardware, planned obsoletism and e-waste. Interconnectivity fosters more energy intensive forms of everyday life. To reduce energy consumption and meet climate change goals, we need research to move beyond the efficiency of digital infrastructure to also intervene somehow in the growing demand for data. And we need to identify environmental impacts of digital technologies in an evidence-based manner, allowing us then to systematically gather and compare knowledge and knowledge gaps, identify obstacles, and develop technical, social, business, and governance-based solutions. So I know much of this talk you may be familiar with, but I wanted to introduce responsible innovation as a way of framing digital sustainability at a complex individual, community and institutional level. Researchers in RI recognise that it's still work in progress, but one area that hasn't yet explicitly been addressed and yet is appropriate to RI is digital sustainability. There is a wider community of people here that are really concerned with this, and there's opportunities to advance the agenda, and I'm happy to discuss how this might happen. I just want to end with an acknowledgement, a shout out to some of the people who've helped along the way. These are of this talk. These are the people from the Robotics Fellowship. These are some of my research group. Big shout out to them who helped some of the research that's gone into this talk. And here are my references. Thank you.
Marina, thank you very much for a very clear, a very concise and compelling manifesto for responsible innovation. The great thing is I suspect you are among friends in this webinar, because all of us, I suspect, on this are in different ways trying to make sense of that journey towards responsible innovation. We've only got 20 minutes for a little bit of chat between the two of us, and I'm feeding off the questions coming in. Please do continue to make comments, add references or whatever on the Slack line, because I think this one will run and run. But I just wanted to come back to you. As I say, I suspect very few people will disagree with the proposition that we need responsible innovation. Just one quick question of clarification someone's asked. I think you mentioned a choice of your 6 pillars of responsible innovation, and I think they were sort of vertically on a slide, and I was going like this. I just wonder, A, whether you could just put those up again for a second, but more importantly, tell us why you chose those particular six pillars. I mean, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they cover a richness of activity, and I saw gender equality in 1 or 2 things. So I just wonder whether you can just either tell us what those 6 pillars were again, and the choice of those, and what you didn't select.
Okay, so actually I can't manage to share my screen right now for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. However, if I go to those 6 pillars again, these actually came from the EU. They're not things that I chose. Right. Initially, when responsible innovation was conceived in the EU as a response to some of the things that I was talking about, these are the 6 pillars that were mentioned. And I'm trying to actually get to these here. I'm sorry, I can't share my screen. I really don't know why.
Yeah, just quickly read them out again.
Okay, so it is open access, governance, ethics, science communication.
Oh, slow down. Open access, governance.
Ethics.
Yeah.
Science communication, public engagement, and gender equality.
Right.
That's the 6 pillars of RI as defined in by the EU. I'm going to make these slides public so everyone you could share them out if that's.
Okay. And you've just taken those from the European Union. You didn't think, because in a sense there's a debate itself about what sustainable, responsible innovation is, and I look at those and I could think of another 15 that I would thought.
Yes, yeah. No,
responsible innovation.
I was talking about what currently exists. Responsible innovation in and of itself is still a research issue. So we can actually add to all of this. And as I was looking at some of the pillars of sustainability, I was thinking, wow, the work is there to be done to harmonize these two initiatives.
Right. Okay. So that's an area itself of conversation to take forward. 1 or 2 comments coming back. I think we see an elegance in the proposition you have, and I love the world that you are painting a picture of. But the digital ICT world, it's the Wild West. The genie is out of the bottle. People are making billions. All sorts of people are using it. There are responsible companies, but there's a whole mass web of activity going on that's maybe not necessarily on the radar. And the other thing is that digital innovation by its nature is happening at a quantum pace. And I suppose I just want to ask quite a big question that, yes, if I get responsible innovation, of course, but in the real world, we are operating in sort of putting a brake and saying, whoa, hang on, we need to have thought, engagement, all the rest of it. It's just for the birds. The world is rampageous at the moment. And I'm just trying to work out whether that dissonance between the elegance of what you're proposing and the reality of the grubby world we're in are just irreconcilable.
Well, I mean, I don't think they're irreconcilable, or else I wouldn't be doing this. Part of the reason that we created Orbit was actually to create that mindset, that change in the ways in which people are innovating with technology. I mean, when I first started in responsible innovation, we did a landscape study of the of the computer scientists around the UK and their attitudes towards responsible innovation that most hadn't heard of, because we're talking about 2011 here. Many of them felt, depending on where they were in the innovation life cycle, that actually this wasn't their responsibility, that it belonged to someone else. How you use it is your business. You know, what you do is your business. We're just here to create and innovate. And many of them, sometimes at that time, felt relatively threatened by the fact that you were taking away that kind of creative notion of creation for the exploratory for discovery. 5-6 years on, that whole landscape has changed quite dramatically, and these sorts of innovators do not want to be responsible for the types of debacles that can occur. I mean, I think the Cambridge Analytica debacle, if you like, really kind of promoted a different way of looking at these types of issues and alerted the public also to the sorts of things that can happen to them, to individuals, and the fact that they can do something about it. I mean, what we're trying to do at another level is work with children to say, or younger people who sometimes feel completely disenfranchised, that they have no impact in this, and to show them that in fact they do. And so they're working with policymakers very closely about the rights that children and young people might have in this space. It's huge what you're saying, and one thing isn't going to change it, but I do believe that we can start to look at those points of tension and start to unpack and unpick them. Naturally, the economic is a huge thing, and companies, as you say, it's the Wild West out there for them. There are other things at play that may try to break that down in the future, none the least sort of deconstructing what those companies may or may not be. But I do believe we can try to change people's thinking and innovators' thinking about this as we're training them.
Yeah. Okay. If we were to run with this, and I was struck by our keynote on Tuesday from David Ferguson from EDF, who's kind of looking at the big trends in the digital world, and he's based in China. And he kind of said, well, we've got, I forget what it was, 3,620 days if we are to meet the Paris targets, and clearly we are well off that pace. I'd be interested to know where you think the biggest wins could be to be beginning to wrestle this beast into a servant of a virtuous society. I mean, is it getting governments to be putting frameworks in place? Is it the United Nations? Is it companies? Is it academic institutions? Of course, it's all of the above, but I'm just wondering where you really get the stranglehold of this out of control beastie.
I think
urgently.
Urgently, it is all of those. It is all of them. I mean, that's what responsible innovation is promoting discourse and engagement from all the relevant stakeholders. You know, I think each of these have been undermined themselves, the particular people that you've just brought up. We need to have different types of discourse and dialogue from representatives of each of those to start to unpack and think about a way forward. You know, if I knew the answer to what you had just asked, I'd be out there doing it now, not here as a keynote. It's very difficult to address what you've just said. But my thought would be, you need representatives from each of those larger institutions and the smaller ones to come together to discuss how. Firstly, it's to recognise we're in this situation, because a lot of people are not even aware of it. And secondly, to how do we bring about that change as quickly as possible? Right. I don't know if David had a better response to that.
No, I think I was going to use some Anglo-Saxon there. I think he's quite worried, although he's paid to be quite optimistic. I mean, I suppose the compounding challenge, and I don't want to, depress myself, is that by its nature, there's a lack of transparency in this. This isn't a sort of open world. The whole innovation is, if I can do something clever over here, I might make $1 billion, and I'm going to keep that information. So the space for a responsible open dialogue, I love it. I'm a facilitator, but by its nature, this area is closed, secretive, highly competitive. There are big wins to be had. So again, that just adds a difficulty in in converting noble endeavor into delivery in this space.
There are researchers now who are writing papers about enforceable accountability and transparency. That somehow industries, we can take a sort of dual approach to this. You could start to say that industries themselves are realizing how important it is to be relatively transparent about what it is they're doing, and some are doing that, others won't. And in that case, certainly some researchers I know are writing about enforcing this kind of approach. And again, that's very difficult because you are always trying to protect the intellectual property of a company or organization. We see that with the AI algorithms at the moment. But there are people who are pushing very strongly for that accountability and transparency. And hopefully, if the public become more aware of these things, they will make better choices about the institutions and organizations that they choose to buy or rely on in any shape or form.
Right. Okay. I just want to read out a question here. And it's come from Claudia, but also linked with Daniel Pargman. And I'll read it out and just get your reaction to it. It says, responsible innovation sounds like responsibility added to innovation after the fact, as an afterthought, and to amend potential negative consequences of innovation as usual. But shouldn't all innovation be responsible? Would this not imply that something more fundamental that drives innovation should be rethought / changed?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with that. And there have been criticisms saying, responsible innovation is just like a plaster after things have happened. And this is precisely why we are doing this training of the younger computer scientists, young innovators, to try to approach it as a different mindset. Of course, all innovation should be responsible, but it's not, because the impacts of it have not been anticipated or thought through. So we are trying to get each of this younger generation to start to think, and they embrace it because they've grown up in a different type of context to perhaps some of the older generation, where these things were not quite so obvious, but they live with this, so they're much more aware of it, and they are, we have quite strong evidence coming through our training that this makes a change. This is a culture change for them.
I mean, I suppose we could look a little bit at some of the trends in big business. About business are now talking about purpose, and purpose being beyond shareholder value and making a quick buck. So I suppose there are some flickers of light. Academic institutions are beginning to, rather than just saying we're a free space for all sorts of talk, they're beginning to frame themselves within a sustainability milieu. So maybe we could point to some hope. Would you share that view?
I would. I mean, I am, even though I suppose this all sounded very depressing, I am quite optimistic generally, and think that we can hold on to those coattails and start to make the changes and build on them, build on what's good, and show why it might be beneficial to them. I think we have to have this public dialogue, though, because I don't think many people understand the environmental cost of streaming videos, of consistently playing AI games, these kinds of things. And I think it would be extremely useful to start having those kinds of public dialogues to have more trustworthy autonomous systems in the future.
I just wonder whether the start, and I always look to, or I'm currently looking to, coronavirus to see how we as society can cope with the challenge. I mean, we were talking about climate change, but really not quite taking it seriously enough. COVID-19 offers us something which is immediately life-threatening. And I just wonder whether, in a sense, I'm particularly interested in the governance side, creating the framework within which innovation, business and other development is allowed to take place. And it strikes me that the biggest threat to the world shows that our governance structures are being tested and shown up to be coming short. I'm not sure I'd like to be sitting in America just right now.
No,
or the
they are
UK.
inadequate. I mean, that is that.
So I just wonder whether, and almost the biggest area that could bring a degree of management control, societal values, is almost the weakest that we have around the globe, unless you happen to be, say, in China, but that comes with a number of consequences.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And this is very much where, again, it's not a panacea, but where the anticipatory governance tries to make some mark that you don't wait until it's absolutely on your doorstep and it's life-threatening. We need to start planning for and thinking about. We've had enough indicators now, both in terms of tech innovation and in terms of science and what's happening in the future, to be able to start anticipating, learning from lessons in the past, anticipating what might come and what might happen in the future. And as I said, trying to create the capacity to deal with that. I think it was clear, I think Obama actually in 2014 was talking about pandemics in particular ways. I mean, I'm not promoting it one president over another, although maybe I am, but I think the point is that these things have been there, have been discussed, they are there, they're under everyone's radar. It's just how, as you put it, their governance strategies are not adequate, they're not sufficient. In fact, they're not useful at all.
And when they're pressure tested, they are. It shows that we are a fragmented, divided. Yeah. Anyway, I just, gosh, this has raised so many thoughts, I'm sure, among so many of us. I just wondered whether you had a final thought. I mean, we keep the conversation going through Slack. There's some great stuff coming up. Everyone, please contribute to Slack and the threads. But this community is we would feel, a responsible community. I mean, last year, a group of 9 of the university published a guide on Digitalize for the environment. So we get it. We feel we're doing our thing as a global research, a small, beautifully put together, delightful research community. Given that every single siren is wailing, every single red light is flashing, the clock appears to be going at an alarming rate, would you have any messages for this set of researchers, this research community who are honestly and honorably getting on with aspects of looking at digital stuff, but who kind of have a bit of a bigger view? Are we doing enough? Because we've produced our Digitalize for the Environment guide. We chat with each other. If you had a walloping great big ambition for a community like this, you know, if one 16-year-old, 17-year-old Dane can do something, what might your ambition for this grouping be, ICT for S?
Well, I mean, I think you need to be braver. I think you need to be much more courageous and have a louder voice. There you are, wherever and whoever you're talking to, because I don't think this really has penetrated. And you know, I made a thing about the call in the digital economy, because that's one of the first kind of calls within EPSA that I've seen that is bringing together the interdisciplinarity that's needed to actually focus on sustainability and digital sustainability here. And that came from lobbying, that came from generally kind of discussing with other kinds of researchers and the need for this. And you know, it's not easy, but I don't think you're loud enough.
Marina, it's been a pleasure and a challenge to us all to have you with us, because your final message, which says, do not for 1 second become complacent. Maybe we are the mouse, the small voice who feels they have no power, but actually
you do.
could have a quantum, just as the whole digital world is doing. Maybe we have to find a quantum way of expressing concern as alongside hope and possibility. I'm sure we will continue this conversation. It underpins everything we are about. Please, if you and colleagues are able to actively join the Slack debate, then I think that will help take us forward. I'm sure we will connect with you and the work you're doing in future. But for now, if I were to listen out of the window across webinar land from Oslo to Toronto to Bristol, a resounding huge round of applause and thank you, Marina, for your presentation. it's, I'm sure, provoked us into further thought and hopefully action. Thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you, Peter. Thank you.
And for everybody else,